Between 1327 and 1377, this 14-year-old kid became England's most terrifying king. We're talking about a guy who won battles when his army was outnumbered 3-1. He took a broken country and turned it into the superpower of medieval Europe. Kings before him failed. Kings after him failed. But Edward III? His 50-year run changed England completely and started its whole path to empire. Tonight, we're diving into what life was actually like under Edward III, England's greatest king. Quick thing, I'm curious where everyone's listening from. Could be London, could be New York, Berlin, maybe Sydney. Drop your city below and what you're doing right now. Are you winding down for the night? Having your morning coffee? I'm recording this around 2 a.m. here in California, so there's something kind of cool about knowing we're all in completely different moments. All right, medieval England. But hold on, get comfortable first. Seriously. Adjust your pillows, grab that blanket, whatever you need. We're going back about 700 years tonight, so you'll want to be settled in. Your eyes open to darkness. The faint glow of embers in the hearth barely illuminates the chamber walls of Windsor Castle. The year is 1327, and you're not just anyone. You're Edward III, King of England, and you're 14 years old. The weight of the fur-lined blanket feels reassuring against the January chill. Cold seeps through the stone walls despite the tapestries. Outside, snow blankets the countryside. Nothing like your warm modern bed with its temperature-controlled comfort. Your breath clouds in front of your face. You've been king for exactly 1 week. 7 days ago they placed a crown on your head at Westminster Abbey, while nobles knelt before you. But let's be real, you're a teenager with a fancy hat. The actual power, that belongs to your mother, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Wait, back up. How did a 14-year-old even become king? Oh boy, that's where it gets wild. See, your father, Edward II, was a disaster of a king. And I don't mean like, oops, I raised taxes, bad. I mean catastrophically. People plotting your violent overthrow bad. The boy needs to understand what happened to his father. You overhear Mortimer telling your mother in hushed tones outside your chamber door. Kings who lose the loyalty of their nobles don't keep their crowns, or sometimes their lives. Unlike many royal kids, you actually knew your father. But Edward II made some spectacularly terrible decisions. Picture the worst boss you've ever had, then give that person absolute power over a country, an army and the national treasury. Your grandfather, Edwardus, they called him Longshanks because the man was basically a medieval basketball player over 6 feet tall, had built England into a powerhouse. He conquered Wales, hammered Scotland, and created a government that actually functioned. Then your dad took over in 1307 and proceeded to undo pretty much everything. My father speaks of the old king with such reverence. You once told your tutor, Richard Berry, during lessons. Was my father truly so different? Your grandfather was a hammer, Berry replied carefully. Your father, well, he preferred favourites to strategy. That was putting it mildly. Within months of becoming king, Edward II handed enormous power to his favourite, Piers Gaveston. The nobles hated Gaveston with the fire of 1,000 suns, not just because he had the king's ear, but because Gaveston was flamboyant, arrogant, and openly mocked them. Their relationship caused scandal throughout Europe. Chroniclers called it excessive, immoderate, and beyond the bounds of reason. The King of France reportedly called Edward II and Gaveston the King and Queen of England. Whether they were lovers or just extraordinarily close friends, Edward II's obsession with Gaveston was political suicide. The nobles eventually had enough. Just months before you were born in 1312, they dragged Gavston out and executed him. Problem solved, right? Yeah, no. Your father found a new favourite, Hugh Despenser. And somehow, Despenser was even worse. The nobility revolted again in 1321, when you were about 9 years old. The king's chamber is no place for a child today, your nurse had said, hurrying you away from your father's apartments. There's talk of war. The wooden floor of the castle corridor had felt cold beneath your feet as you were rushed back to your chambers. Behind you, the shouting continued. While Edward II initially defeated this rebellion and executed its leader, his relationship with your mother, Queen Isabella, completely fell apart. He gave so much power to Despenser that Isabella felt threatened. When she travelled to her native France on a diplomatic mission in 1325, she refused to return. And here's where it gets even wilder. Your mother, Isabella of France, started a relationship with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron. Together they plotted to overthrow your father. You were sent to France in 1325, and the following year, Isabella and Mortimer launched an invasion of England with you as their figurehead. The Queen returns not as a wife, but as an avenger, supporters proclaimed when your mother's small army landed in Suffolk in September 1326. You were only 13, watching your mother and Mortimer gather forces to depose your father. Awkward doesn't begin to cover it. The invasion succeeded almost without resistance. People were so tired of Edward VII and the Despensers that they welcomed Isabella as a liberator. Your father fled but was captured in November. Despenser was executed. Brutally. And I mean brutally. We're talking dragged behind horses, castrated, disemboweled, beheaded and quartered. Medieval justice did not mess around. In January 1327, Parliament forced your father to abdicate. And suddenly there you were, a teenager with a crown, nominal ruler of a kingdom you had barely seen in years. You roll over in bed, the straw mattress crinkling beneath you. Unlike your memory foam mattress at home, this one pokes and shifts. At least you get a real bed. Most people in 1327 sleep on the floor. The fire has nearly died, and your chamber feels damp despite the January cold. The smells of the castle drift through, smoke, unwashed bodies, and the lingering aroma of last night's roasted meat. The gentleman of the bedchamber assigned to sleep near you snores softly on his pallet. You lie awake thinking about your father. He's still alive, imprisoned at Kenilworth Castle. You've been told you'll never see him again. Officially, you're king. But your mother and Mortimer are the real rulers of England. We act only in the king's name and for his benefit, Mortimer had announced to the court, until his grace reaches maturity. But even at 14, you're smart enough to know what's happening. Your mother and Mortimer control the government, the treasury, even who gets to speak to you. You're a puppet. This shouldn't be surprising. Throughout the Middle Ages, child kings were manipulated by regents and powerful nobles. But unlike most of them, you're already planning your escape from these constraints. You may be young, but you've received training in the skills that matter for a medieval king. You can ride a horse better than most grown men. You're learning swordplay and archery. You're studying military strategy. The concepts of honour, chivalry and kingship have been drilled into you since you could walk. A king must be like the lion, your martial instructor once told you. Fierce in battle, generous in victory, and always, always aware of his enemies. Right now your enemies include your supposed protectors. Outside the cock crows, dawn approaches, Another day of pretending to be in charge while having no actual power. But you're patient, you're observing, you're learning. And here's where our story really begins. Because unlike so many medieval royal tragedies, you, Edward III, won't remain a puppet. You won't die young or get manipulated your entire reign. In fact, over the next 50 years, you'll transform England from a chaotic, fractured kingdom into one of the most powerful states in Europe. You'll win battles where you're hopelessly outnumbered. You'll claim the throne of France, starting the 100 Years' War. You'll survive the Black Death, the worst pandemic in human history. You'll reform law, language, and government in ways that still impact the modern world. Not bad for a 14-year-old kid who started with basically nothing. The first rays of sunlight filter through the narrow window of your chamber. Time to rise. Time to begin the performance of kingship while secretly planning your liberation. Outside in the courtyard, guards change shifts. The castle begins to stir. Servants move quietly, preparing for the day. The smoke from cooking fires rises above the walls. Horses neigh in the stables. "Your Grace," a voice calls softly. It's one of your attendants, ready to begin the elaborate ritual of dressing the king. It is time. With a deep breath, you push back the covers. The cold air hits you immediately and you suppress a shiver. Kings don't show weakness, even teenage kings. You stand, stretching limbs still growing toward manhood. Your nightshirt, made of fine linen, offers little protection against the chill. Soon they'll dress you in the heavy, ornate garments of kingship, the physical embodiment of a power you don't yet possess. But you will. Oh, you will. The year ahead will bring your first military campaign, your first real taste of battle. Not that it will go particularly well. The Scots, taking advantage of England's internal chaos, have been raiding the northern borders. Your mother and Mortimer will lead an army north with you as the figurehead. "The king must be seen to defend his realm," Mortimer had declared, though everyone knew he merely wanted to use your presence to legitimize his command. The campaign would become known as the Weardale Campaign, named after the river where most of the action took place. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for the English. The Scots run circles around your forces, even penetrating your camp one night, nearly capturing you. You'll remember that humiliation, the helplessness, the frustration. "When I command for real," you whisper to yourself in the pre-dawn light, "things will be different." Your attendants enter fully now, carrying fresh water for washing, a luxury reserved for royalty. Most people in 1327 rarely bathe, maybe a few times a year. The idea that bathing might spread disease rather than prevent it has taken root in medieval thinking. They wash your face and hands, then begin the process of dressing you. Layer upon layer of clothing to combat the cold and display your status. Linen shirt, woolen tunic, a surcoat embroidered with the royal arms of England. The 3 lions passant that still represent England today. The fabrics itch against your skin. Nothing like the soft cotton you're used to in your bed right now. Medieval fabrics were functional, but rarely comfortable. Breakfast will be simple by royal standards. Bread, ale, yes, even for a 14-year-old. Perhaps some cold meat from last night's dinner. The concept of special breakfast foods is centuries away. As you break your fast, you'll begin another day of careful observation, watching how Mortimer rules, studying how your mother wields influence, learning the complex web of alliances and enmities that make up the English nobility. You're playing the long game, biding your time, and in 3 years you'll make your move. but that's for another part of our story. For now, you're Edward III, 14 years old, King of England in name only. The crown is heavy, the castle is cold, and the path ahead is uncertain. Yet as the medieval dawn breaks over Windsor Castle, something stirs within you. The makings of a king who will one day be remembered as one of England's greatest. A king who will transform warfare, survive plague, reform government, and set England on the path to empire. Not bad for a teenager's first week on the job. The Scottish raiders moved like ghosts through the English camp. It was past midnight, the darkness nearly complete except for a few dying campfires. You're still Edward III, and it's now July 1327. 6 months into your reign, and you're in the middle of your first military disaster. "Cut the tent ropes," someone shouts in a thick Scottish accent. Your royal tent collapses around you. Panic floods your body as you scramble for a weapon, any weapon. You're 14, remember? Fighting in the dark against seasoned Scottish raiders isn't exactly a fair match. Men are screaming all around you. The clash of steel on steel, the thud of bodies falling. The camp is in chaos. "Protect the king," your guards shout, forming a desperate circle around your collapsed tent. This moment, this near capture by the Scots during the Weardale campaign, will burn itself into your memory. The humiliation of it, the fear, but most of all, the helplessness of being a king who cannot even command his own defence. "Your Grace, are you hurt?" asks William Montague, one of your few loyal friends, as he helps extract you from the fallen tent. He's a few years older than you, barely 20 himself, but already showing the loyalty that will make him one of your most trusted commanders in years to come. "I'm unharmed," you mutter, though your pride is thoroughly wounded. The Scottish raiders withdraw as quickly as they came, melting back into the darkness. They've made their point. The English army, your army, is vulnerable, outmaneuvered, and effectively useless. For 3 weeks, you've been chasing the Scottish force led by James Douglas and the Earls of Mer and Moray. Or rather, Mortimer has been leading your army in your name, making a complete hash of it. The Scots have danced circles around you, refusing to engage directly, raiding your supply lines, and generally making the English look like fools. The whole campaign will end without a significant battle, forcing Mortimer to negotiate the humiliating Treaty of Northampton, acknowledging Scottish independence and Robert Bruce as King of Scotland. Another blow to English pride, another failure hung around your neck despite being too young to actually command. "This is how war is waged," Mortimer tells you the next morning, as if the raid was simply an expected inconvenience. "The Scots are savages, but crafty ones." You say nothing, but inside, you're taking notes on Mortimer's failures, on Scottish tactics, on what it truly means to command. You may be a puppet king now, but you're learning, always learning. Dawn breaks over the English camp. The aftermath of the night raid is evident everywhere. Torn tents, wounded men groaning, equipment scattered. The morning dew dampens your boots as you walk through the camp, the rich earthy smell of mud and trampled grass filling your nostrils. Back at the command tent, Mortimer and your mother are deep in discussion. Isabella of France, the she-wolf as some already call her, is no delicate royal flower. She led the invasion that put you on the throne after all. "We cannot sustain this campaign," she says firmly. "The northern lords are wavering in their support. We must return to London and secure our position there." Mortimer nods. "The boy has been seen in battle. That was our primary objective." The boy. That's how they refer to you, even in your presence. Not as king, not even by name. The boy. 3 years. That's how long you'll tolerate this treatment. 3 years of watching, learning, and gradually building a network of loyal men your own age, like William Montagu. The next 3 years pass in a blur of ceremonies, hunting expeditions, and carefully supervised training in the arts of war. You grow taller, stronger, your voice deepens, you begin to truly look the part of king, even if you lack the power. In 1328, at the age of 16, you're married to Philippa of Hainault, fulfilling an agreement your mother made to secure support for her invasion. Unlike many royal marriages, this one will prove remarkably happy. Philippa is smart, capable, and quickly becomes popular with the English people. She has kind eyes, you remark to Montagu after meeting your bride for the first time. And her father's coin, Montagu replies with a wink. Hainault's support will be useful when the time comes. The time he refers to is your planned coup against Mortimer and your mother. By 1330, the country has grown tired of their rule. Mortimer's greed has alienated many nobles. There are whispers that he and Isabella plan to set you aside somehow, perhaps in favour of a child of their own. October 1330, Nottingham Castle. You're 18 now, nearly a man grown by medieval standards. Tonight, everything changes. The castle is imposing, built on a sandstone cliff with caves beneath it. Mortimer and Isabella have taken the strongest rooms in the inner keep, with guards posted at every approach. But there's another way in, through those caves. Are you certain of this passage? You ask William Montagu, who leads your small band of conspirators. The darkness of the tunnel seems to swallow the light from your carefully shielded lantern. The smell of damp earth and rock surrounds you. Water drips somewhere in the darkness. My lord, I swear it on my life, Montagu replies. The passage leads directly up into the keep. You can feel your heart pounding. If this fails, you'll be labelled a traitor. Execution would likely follow. Even kings aren't safe from the headsman's axe when they're labelled traitors. Your father learned that lesson. The stone passageway is narrow, forcing you to crouch as you ascend. The rough walls scrape against your shoulders. The weight of the castle seems to press down on you. One cave in, and you'd be buried forever. The boy king who died in darkness. After what seems like hours but is probably only minutes, Montagu stops. We're beneath their chambers now, he whispers. When we emerge, we must move quickly. You nod, mouth too dry to speak. The weight of the moment presses on you like the stone above. 18 years old, about to seize a kingdom by force. For England, you finally manage to whisper. For the true king, your loyal men respond. Moments later, you burst into the castle proper through a hidden door, startling a guard who barely has time to shout before Montagu silences him. Then you're running through torchlit corridors, the element of surprise your only advantage against Mortimer's superior numbers. You reach Isabella's apartments first. The door splinters under your men's assault. Inside, the scene burns itself into your memory. Your mother, the Queen of England, in her night clothes, face pale with shock. Beside her stands Roger Mortimer, reaching for his sword. "What is the meaning of this?" Isabella demands, but there's fear in her voice. She knows. "Roger Mortimer," you announce, your voice steady despite your racing heart. "I arrest you for treason against the crown." "You have no authority, boy," Mortimer snarls, drawing his blade. "I am the protector of this realm." The fight is brief but violent. 2 of Mortimer's guards die defending him. One of your men falls. Blood splashes across the fine tapestries of the royal apartments. The metallic smell of it fills the air. mingling with the smoke from the torches. Finally, Mortimer is subdued, forced to his knees before you. Your mother screams, alternating between threats and pleas. "If you harm him, I will never forgive you," she cries. You look at her, this woman who gave you life, who fought to put you on the throne, and who then kept you from true power. "Mother," you say, your voice suddenly tired beyond your years, "from this day I rule in my own name." The following day, you announce to an assembled parliament that you have taken personal control of your kingdom. Mortimer is sent to London for trial, though the outcome is predetermined. On November 29th, 1330, he becomes the first person ever executed at Tyburn, beginning a grim tradition that will last for centuries. Your mother is spared execution but placed under house arrest at Castle Rising in Norfolk. She'll live there in comfortable confinement for nearly 30 years, gradually becoming more pious and eventually becoming a nun before her death. With the coup complete, you finally hold the power that should have been yours all along. At 18, you've already learned harsh lessons about betrayal, power, and the dangers of weakness. Now it's time to show England and Europe what kind of king you truly are. Your first challenge remains Scotland. The humiliating Treaty of Northampton signed during your puppet years still stings. The northern English lords who hold lands in southern Scotland have begun calling themselves the Disinherited and are agitating for war. The Scottish question requires a permanent solution, you tell your council in the spring of 1332, not just for our northern lords, but for the security of all England. You don't officially support the invasion launched by the disinherited lords that summer, but you don't stop it either. When they win a stunning victory at Duplin Moor in August, crushing the Scottish army and installing Edward Balliol as a puppet king of Scotland, you recognise the opportunity. By early 1333, Balliol has been pushed back into England, and now you have the perfect excuse to intervene directly. You move the entire English government north to York and prepare for war in earnest. The siege of Berwick begins in March. The critical border town, currently in Scottish hands, is the key to controlling the frontier. For months, your forces surround the city, cutting it off from supplies. They'll surrender when they're hungry enough, your commanders assure you. But before starvation can do its work, the Scots assemble a relief army under Sir Archibald Douglas. In mid-July, they send word to the besieged town, "Hold out until the 20th, and we'll come to your rescue." This is the moment you've been waiting for since that humiliating night raid during the Weardale campaign, a chance to face the Scots in open battle, to prove yourself as a warrior king. July 19th, 1333, Halidon Hill. Your first great battle. Dawn breaks cold and clear. From your position on the hillside you can see the Scottish army approaching, nearly 20,000 men to your 8,000. The odds would terrify most commanders, but you've positioned your forces perfectly on high ground. They'll have to come to us, you tell your captains, uphill into our archers. This is where your military revolution begins. While most European armies rely on heavily armoured knights as their main striking force, you've recognised the devastating potential of the English longbow, a weapon so powerful it can punch through armour at 200 yards, and your archers can loose 10-12 arrows per minute. The morning sun glints off helmets and spear points in the distance. The air smells of trampled grass, smoke from breakfast fires, and the sweat of nervous men. Your own armour weighs heavily on you, 60 pounds of shaped steel plate and chain mail that protects but also exhausts. "The Scots approach, your grace," reports Henry Percy, one of your northern lords. "They've formed 3 divisions for the assault." You nod, mouth dry despite the water you've just drunk. Our archers know their business? They do, sire, the best bowmen in England. Around mid-morning, the Scottish army begins its advance. From your vantage point, they look like a slow-moving tide of men and metal flowing toward your position. Banners snap in the breeze. War horns sound. Hold, you command as they draw nearer. Let them struggle uphill first. The Scots are barely within conventional bow range when you give the signal, archers, loose. What happens next will change warfare forever. Thousands of arrows arc into the sky, briefly blotting out the sun before raining death on the advancing Scots. The sound is like a storm, the whip of bowstrings, the hiss of arrows in flight, then the terrible impact as they find flesh and armour. The Scottish front ranks falter under this deadly rain, but Douglas urges them forward. Again and again, your archers loose their arrows. Men fall by the hundreds, yet still the Scots advance. God's teeth, they're brave, mutters William Bohun, Earl of Northampton, at your side. Bravery won't stop an arrow, you reply, watching as the Scottish formations begin to break up on the slope. By the time the survivors reach your lines, they're disorganized, winded from the climb, and drastically reduced in number. Now it's time for your dismounted men-at-arms to engage. Forward, you command, leading your division into battle personally. The clash of armies is like nothing else on earth. The deafening noise, the press of bodies, the smell of blood and fear and emptied bowels. Men scream as they die. Steel rings on steel. Horses shriek in pain. You swing your sword with all the training of your youth behind each blow. A Scottish knight falls before you, then another. Your guards press close, ensuring England doesn't lose its king in his first major battle. Within hours it's over. The Scottish army breaks and flees, leaving thousands of dead behind, including Archibald Douglas himself. By contrast, English casualties are minimal, perhaps a few hundred. Halidon Hill is more than a victory. It's a complete vindication of your military strategy, your leadership, and your right to rule. Berwick surrenders the next day and will remain English for centuries to come. That evening, as you walk among your troops, men who hours earlier were farmers and tradesmen stare at you with new eyes. No longer the puppet boy king, but Edward III, warrior of Halidon Hill. The king fought like a lion, you overhear one archer telling his companions. Saw him cut down 2 knights myself. You smile to yourself. This is how legends begin, in blood and victory and stories told around campfires. Back in your command tent, you remove your armour piece by piece. Each plate and mail link is spattered with blood and mud. Your body aches from the weight and exertion. Bruises are already forming where blows struck you despite the protection. A servant brings wine, and you drink deeply, suddenly aware of how thirsty battle has made you. The taste is rich and strong, nothing like the watered wine served at court functions. To Scotland's new king, toasts William Montague, raising his own cup. Edward Balliol is in your debt, your grace. And will remain so, you reply. Balliol has already agreed that Scotland will be a vassal state to England, undoing decades of Scottish independence. It's a stunning reversal of fortune from the humiliations of the Weardale campaign. That night, despite your exhaustion, sleep comes slowly. Your mind replays the battle, the flight of arrows, the clash of steel, the faces of men in their last moments. This is the first major blood you've shed as king, but far from the last. In the darkness of your tent, listening to the sounds of the camp settling for the night, you consider what lies ahead. Scotland is just the beginning. Across the Channel lies France, ruled by your mother's brother, King Philip VI. By right of blood through your mother, you have a claim to the French throne, a claim you'll soon decide to press, launching what history will call the 100 Years' War. But that's another chapter in your story. For tonight, you are Edward III, 21 years old, victorious at Halidon Hill, no longer a puppet, but a king in truth. The road from powerless teenager to master of England has been short but brutal, and your greatest battles, both in war and in statecraft, still lie ahead. The salt spray hits your face as your ship cuts through the Channel waves. It's June 1340, and you're sailing toward the greatest naval battle of your era. The weight of chain mail and plate armour makes the rolling deck treacherous. One wrong step and you'd plunge into the cold water, sinking like a stone in all that metal. "French ships sighted, your grace," shouts the lookout from his perch. You shade your eyes against the morning sun. On the horizon near the Flemish port of Slees, the French fleet sits in formation, over 200 ships to your 150. Another battle where you're outnumbered, but unlike at Halidon Hill, this time you're fighting at sea. "How are you feeling?" asks William Montague, now Earl of Salisbury, thanks to your favour. "First naval battle and all that." "Like I might lose my breakfast over the side," you admit with a wry smile. "Even kings get seasick." "Well, try to aim at the French if you do," he replies. "Might give us an edge." 7 years have passed since your victory at Halidon Hill. 7 years of consolidating power in England, managing the ever-restless Scotland, and laying the groundwork for your greatest ambition, the crown of France. This whole French adventure started with the legal dispute. Remember how your father had been Duke of Aquitaine, that chunk of southwestern France owned by English kings for generations. As Duke, he technically owed fealty to the King of France. The arrangement had always been awkward, but it became truly problematic when your mother's brother, Charles V of France, died without a male heir in 1328. By blood, you had the best claim to the French throne through your mother, but the French nobility couldn't stomach the idea of an English king ruling France. They chose Philip of Valois instead, crowning him Philip VI. At the time, you were only 15 and still under Isabella and Mortimer's control. They reluctantly accepted the situation, and you even paid homage to Philip in 1329 as his vassal for Aquitaine. "Knelt like a common servant," you mutter to yourself now, the memory still rankling. Never again. In the years since taking control of your kingdom, tensions with France have steadily escalated. Philip VI seized the county of Ponthieu from you and supported the Scots against England. In 1337, he declared Aquitaine forfeit, effectively confiscating your French lands. That was the final straw. In response, you formally claimed the crown of France for yourself, quartering the French royal arms with your own English lions. The date, January 26, 1340, marks the official beginning of what future historians will call the 100 Years' War. 10 minutes until we're in range, your grace, reports your ship's captain, pulling you back to the present. French aren't moving. Seems they're waiting for us. You nod, studying the enemy fleet. They've chained their ships together in 3 lines across the harbour entrance, a floating fortress. Traditional naval warfare in 1340 isn't about fancy manoeuvres. It's about turning sea battles into land battles fought on wooden platforms. They think we'll break against them like waves on rocks, you observe. Let's show them what English archers can do at sea. This is the gamble, using the same longbow tactics that won Halidon Hill, but on rolling ships where keeping balance while shooting is infinitely harder. The French have crossbowmen from Genoa, professional soldiers who can pierce armour at close range, but their weapons take nearly a minute to reload. Your English longbowmen can loose 10 to 12 arrows in that same time. Archers to the forecastles, you command. Men-at-arms, prepare to board on my signal. Your heart pounds as your fleet closes with the French. The noise grows, shouts from captains, the creak of ships, the snap of sails in the wind. The smell of salt water mixes with pitch, sweat, and fear. French crossbowmen in range, someone shouts. Hold, you command, wanting optimal distance for your archers. Crossbow bolts begin to thud into the wooden hull and deck. A man nearby cries out, falling with a bolt through his shoulder. Blood spreads across his tunic, shockingly bright against the weathered deck. Now, archers, loose, you shout. The sound of thousands of bowstrings releasing at once is like the world's largest harp playing a single deadly note. Arrows darken the sky, arcing high before plunging down onto the French ships. Unlike at Halidon Hill, where the Scots could at least try to dodge or seek cover, the French sailors and soldiers are packed tightly on their chained vessels with nowhere to run. The first volley is devastating. Men fall by the dozens. Screams carry across the water. Again, you command. Volley after volley rains down. The French crossbowmen try to return fire, but they're overwhelmed by the sheer volume of English arrows. Their tight formation, meant to be a strength, has become a deadly trap. Forward! Prepare to board, you shout as your ships close to grappling range. The first collision is jarring, wood grinding against wood, the impact nearly knocking you off your feet. Grappling hooks fly, pulling the ships together. Boarding planks slam down. For England and King Edward, your men roar as they surge forward. You're among them, sword drawn, leading from the front as a medieval king must. The ship-to-ship fighting is brutal, confined and chaotic. Men slip on decks slick with blood and seawater. The cries of the wounded mix with battle shouts. Steel rings against steel. An enemy knight recognizes you from your royal surcoat and charges. You parry his first blow, feeling the impact jar up your arm. Your counter-strike catches him at the neck joint of his armour. Hot blood sprays as he falls. No time to think about it. Another opponent is already pressing forward. This one's bigger, swinging a wicked battle axe that would cleave you in two if it connected. "Duck, your grace," shouts Montague, and you drop just as the axe whistles overhead. Montague's sword takes the axeman in the belly. The man falls, howling between the ships, disappearing into the bloodied water below. "Getting too old for this," Montague pants, though he's barely 30. "Nonsense," you reply, wiping sweat from your eyes. "You're just reaching your prime." The battle rages for hours under the summer sun. Ship by ship, the French line is broken. Their admiral, Nicolas Boucher, fights to the last but is eventually captured. By evening, the sea at Sluys runs red. Nearly 18,000 French sailors and soldiers lie dead or dying. All but 23 French ships have been captured or destroyed. Victory is complete, but not without cost. During the fighting, an arrow caught you in the thigh, a painful but not life-threatening wound that will leave yet another scar on your body. "The Channel belongs to England now," Montague says, as a physician tends your injury back on your flagship. The arrow has been extracted, the wound cleaned with wine and bandaged. The pain throbs with each heartbeat. And Philip knows it, you agree, wincing as you shift position. No French king will threaten English shores in our lifetime. The naval victory at Sluys secures your southern coast and ensures you can move troops to the continent at will. England can breathe easier knowing that French invasion ships no longer patrol the Channel. But the war has barely begun. Your claim to the French throne remains contested, and Philip VI still holds most of your ancestral lands in Aquitaine. The battles ahead will make Slays look like a skirmish. The following day, you dictate a letter to be sent to your council in London, announcing the victory. You can't resist adding a barb directed at the French king. Philip has not yet made himself master of the English Channel. Messages travel slowly in medieval Europe, carried by riders who change horses at intervals but still cover only 30-40 miles per day on roads that barely deserve the name. It will be days before England learns of your triumph. By mid-July, you're back on English soil, nursing your wound but celebrating a victory that has made you the master of the seas. Londoners cheer as you ride through the streets, the arrow wound forcing you to move more slowly than usual, but you make sure not to limp. Kings don't show weakness. God save King Edward of England and France, they shout, embracing your claim to the dual monarchy. The next 3 years bring a mixture of frustration and achievement. Campaign season after campaign season in France yields territorial gains, but no decisive victory. Philip VI refuses to meet you in open battle, remembering the lessons of Sluys. Then in November 1342, you return secretly to England to confront your government about financial issues. The war is costing a fortune, perhaps $124 just in the first year, several times your annual income. You've been forced to borrow heavily from Italian banking families and introduce new taxes at home. The realm cannot sustain this pace of spending, warns John Stratford, Archbishop of Canterbury and your chief minister. We must either find a decisive victory or seek terms. You clash with Stratford initially. Kings don't appreciate being told they can't afford their wars, but eventually reconcile. His point is valid. Medieval warfare is ruinously expensive, and even England's growing wealth has limits. Meanwhile, events in Brittany create a new front in your war with France. When Duke John III of Brittany dies without a clear heir in 1341, 2 candidates emerge, Charles of Blois, supported by Philip VI, and John de Montfort, who seeks your backing. Brittany is the key to northern France, your advisors explain. Whoever controls it can threaten Paris itself. You agree to support Montfort's claim, turning the Breton succession dispute into another theatre of the wider Anglo-French conflict. What historians will later call the War of the Breton Succession will drag on for decades. By 1345, you've had enough of inconclusive campaigns. It's time for a bold stroke that will force Philip VI either to battle or to terms. You begin assembling a major new invasion force in England. This time, you tell your council, we strike at the heart of France, not just its edges. Throughout the winter of 1345-46, ships are requisitioned, supplies gathered, and men mustered. Armourers work day and night forging plate armour and arrowheads. Fletchers produce hundreds of thousands of arrows. Bakers prepare hardtack biscuits that will keep for months at sea and on campaign. The logistics are staggering for a medieval operation. Your army will need at least 20,000 horses, not just for knights but for transportation. Each horse requires about 20 pounds of fodder daily. The math is simple and brutal. Without proper supply, your army starves or dissolves within weeks. Finally, on July 12th, 1346, your invasion force lands on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. Nearly 15,000 men and thousands of horses disembark in a massive operation that's been months in planning. You're 33 now, in your physical prime, hardened by years of warfare and kingship. The golden-haired youth who seized power from Mortimer has become a seasoned commander with a reputation throughout Europe. "What's our objective, Your Grace?" asks the Prince of Wales, your eldest son and namesake, who at 16 is joining his first major campaign. The Black Prince, as he'll come to be known from the colour of his armour, is eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. He resembles you, tall, strong, with the same determined set to his jaw, but lacks your experience. "We're going to remind Philip what it means to face English arms," you tell him, "and if he won't meet us in battle, we'll make his kingdom bleed until he has no choice." What follows is a massive chevauchée, a destructive cavalry raid designed to wreak economic havoc. Your army cuts a swath of destruction across Normandy, burning towns, seizing supplies, and generally terrorizing the countryside. The strategy is brutal but effective. Medieval armies rely on local resources. By destroying those resources, you deny them to your enemy. It's also a direct challenge to Philip VI. A king who cannot protect his people is no king at all. On July 26th, your forces seize the significant town of Caen in Normandy. For 5 days the city is sacked, its wealth flowing into English coffers. Reports of the fall of Caen spread panic through northern France. Philip will have to respond now, you tell your commanders. His nobles won't allow this to continue unchallenged. You're right. Philip VI begins gathering a massive force to protect Paris, which now lies open to your advance. By mid-August he has assembled well over 20,000 men, perhaps twice your numbers. But direct confrontation with superior French forces isn't your plan. Instead, you skirt Paris and turn north toward Flanders, where you hope to link up with allies from the Low Countries. Philip pursues, determined to trap your army before it can escape. The chase becomes a race, with your forces marching up to 30 miles a day, an exhausting pace for men in armour carrying weapons and supplies. By late August, Philip is closing in. Your army's path to safety is blocked by the Somme River, its fords guarded by French forces. Trapped between the river and Philip's approaching army, your position seems desperate. "We're caught between the hammer and the anvil," mutters the Earl of Warwick, one of your commanders. "Not yet," you reply, dispatching scouts to find an unguarded crossing. Fortune favours you when a local peasant, bribed or coerced, reveals the Blanchetaque ford, passable at low tide. Your army races for the crossing, makes it across barely hours before Philip's forces arrive, and continues north. By August 26th, you've reached Crécy-en-Ponthieu, where you decide to make your stand. Your men are exhausted from weeks of marching and fighting. They need rest, and the ground here favours defence. "We fight here," you announce, studying the gently sloping terrain. "Let Philip come to us." Throughout the day, you personally supervise the deployment of your forces. Unlike most medieval commanders, you've learned to use terrain to maximum advantage. You position your army on the high ground, with your flanks protected by woods and a river. Your men-at-arms dismount to fight on foot, with massed longbowmen on the wings. As evening approaches, scouts report that Philip's army is approaching from the south, tired from forced marches but still nearly twice your size. The stage is set for one of the most decisive battles of the medieval period. You gather your commanders for final instructions as the sun begins to set. Among them is your 16-year-old son, the Black Prince, who will command one of the divisions with experienced captains to guide him. "Remember Halidon Hill," you tell them. "Let them come to us. Let the arrows do their work. Stand firm, and victory will be ours." As you dismiss them to their posts, you take a moment alone with your son. The Prince of Wales looks both eager and nervous, the weight of his first major command visible in his stance. "Father," he says quietly, "what if I fail you?" You place a hand on his armoured shoulder. "You won't. You were born for this, as was I. But remember, courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about doing what must be done despite it." He nods, standing straighter. "For England," he says. "For England," you echo. "Now go show them what a Prince of Wales can do." As your son walks away to his division, you take a moment to look out over the field where thousands will die tomorrow. The setting sun casts long shadows across the gentle slopes. Birds call in the nearby woods, oblivious to the carnage to come. For all your confidence in your tactical position, nothing in war is certain. By this time tomorrow you could be dead, captured, or victorious. Such is the narrow margin between disaster and glory. You've come a long way from that 14-year-old puppet king. Through will, cunning, and courage, you've transformed yourself into Edward III, warrior king of England, claimant to the French throne, master of the seas after Slees. Tomorrow at Crécy, you'll either cement that legacy or watch it crumble. Either way, the battle will change the course of European history forever. Dawn breaks over Crécy on August 26th, 1346. The air is cool, the grass still damp with dew. You stand on the slope, watching as the massive French army appears on the horizon. Their armour gleams in the morning light, banners fluttering in the breeze. So many banners, each representing a noble house, a fighting unit, 1,000 individual stories about to end. "God's teeth. There are a lot of them," mutters William Bohun, Earl of Northampton, beside you. "Numbers aren't everything," you reply, trying to sound more confident than you feel. You've arranged your army in 3 divisions, one commanded by your 16-year-old son, the Black Prince, another by Northampton, and the third by yourself. Each has dismounted men-at-arms in the centre, with longbowmen on the wings, positioned in a formation resembling a harrow or a wedge. And you have one more surprise for the French. Near your position sit several small, odd-looking metal tubes mounted on wooden frames. The French have never seen these weapons before, neither has most of your army. "You really think these cannons will make a difference?" asks Northampton, eyeing the strange devices sceptically. "Probably not," you admit, "but the noise alone might be worth it." These primitive artillery pieces are a novelty in European warfare. They fire stone balls and are more likely to frighten horses than cause significant casualties. But war is as much about psychology as physics. By midday, the French army is assembled on the plain below your position. Their knights and men-at-arms gleam in the sun, a forest of lances rising above them. At the rear, you can make out the blue banner decorated with golden fleur-de-lis, the royal standard of Philip VI. Oddly, there's no immediate attack. The French seem to be milling around, arguing among themselves. Even from a distance you can sense the confusion in their ranks. "What are they waiting for?" asks your son, who has ridden over from his division. "They have no real commander," you explain. "Philip is king, but he's no general. His nobles each want the glory of leading the first charge." This is the fundamental weakness of the French feudal army. Though larger than your force, it's really dozens of different contingents, each led by a nobleman more concerned with honour than strategy. A sudden shower passes over the field, briefly drenching both armies. Your archers quickly unstring their bows to keep the strings dry, then restring them when the rain stops. "That's another advantage," you tell your son. "Our men are professional soldiers who know their craft. The French are a mob of nobles with their retainers." Finally, in the late afternoon, the French begin to advance. First come their crossbowmen, Genoese mercenaries hired for their skill. Behind them march the French knights and men-at-arms, eager for glory. Back to your position, you tell your son. Remember what I taught you. Let them come to us. Wait for my signal. The prince nods, his face solemn beneath his helmet. For England, he says, clasping your arm briefly before riding back to his division. For England, you echo. The Genoese crossbowmen advance up the slope, stopping about 150 yards from your lines. Close enough for their weapons, but still well within the deadly range of the English longbow. They loose their first volley, but most bolts fall, short or stick harmlessly in the ground. Not yet, you call to your archers, who are itching to return fire. Let them come closer. The Genoese reload, a slow, cumbersome process involving a cranking mechanism, and advance another few yards. Again they fire, and again their bolts largely waste themselves on empty ground. Now, you command, archers, loose. The sound of thousands of bowstrings releasing at once is like a massive gust of wind. Arrows darken the sky, arcing high before plunging down onto the Genoese. Unlike the crossbowmen, who fired individually, your archers loose their arrows in coordinated volleys, creating a devastating concentration of missile fire. The effect is immediate and horrific. Hundreds of Genoese fall in the first volley, arrows punching through leather armour and flesh with equal ease. They've never faced anything like the English longbow, which can launch up to 12 arrows per minute at a range of 250 yards. Again, you command, and another dark cloud of arrows ascends. The Genoese break almost immediately, turning to flee back down the hill. But behind them, the French knights and men-at-arms are still advancing, eager for glory. Cowards! You hear the French nobles shouting at their retreating mercenaries. Some even cut down their own crossbowmen in their fury. Now the French knights charge uphill, directly into the arrow storm. Horses scream as shafts pierce their unarmoured flanks. Riders tumble from saddles. The neatly ordered lines dissolve into chaos. Now the cannons, you order. The primitive gunpowder weapons roar to life, more noise than actual threat. But the psychological impact is immediate. The French horses, already panicked by the arrows, go completely wild at the thunderous sound and flash. "They're breaking," shouts Northampton, pointing to the French left wing. But it's too early to celebrate. The French numbers are so great that even with their front ranks in disarray, more keep coming. Wave after wave surges up the hill. The heaviest fighting focuses on your son's division. The Count of Alençon, Philip's brother, leads a determined assault directly at the Black Prince's position. "My son needs reinforcements," you say, watching the desperate struggle. "Do we send some men from our division?" asks Northampton. You hesitate, torn between a father's instinct and a king's responsibility. If you weaken your centre to support your son, you might compromise the entire battle line. If you don't, he could be overwhelmed. A messenger arrives, breathing hard. "My lord, the Earl of Warwick begs assistance for the prince's division." "Is my son injured?" you demand. "No, your grace, but they are hard-pressed." You make your decision. "Tell Warwick the prince must win his spurs today. I will not risk the battle, but I have faith in my son." The messenger looks shocked but bows and gallops back toward the struggle. Your words might seem cruel, but this is your son's first real test as a commander. He must learn to fight through crisis without rescue. "A hard choice," observes Northampton quietly. "Kingship is nothing but hard choices," you reply. As evening approaches, the battle reaches its climax. The French knights, dismounted now after losing so many horses to arrows, struggle uphill on foot in their heavy armour. Your archers, having exhausted their arrows, join the hand-to-hand combat with knives, swords and hammers. The noise is deafening. The clash of steel, the screams of wounded men, the battle cries in French and English. The smell of blood, sweat and fear hangs thick in the air. The gentle slopes of Crécy have become a charnel house. Blind King John of Bohemia, fighting for the French though he cannot see, orders his knights to tie their horses together so he can ride into battle with them. They charge directly into the English line, all to be slaughtered. It's both magnificent and utterly futile. The old man had courage. I'll give him that, says Northampton after reports of the blind king's death reach you. Courage without wisdom is just waste, you reply, though privately you admire such commitment. As darkness falls, the French attacks finally begin to falter. Philip VI himself is wounded and led from the field. Without their king, the remaining French nobles lose what little coordination they had. By midnight, it's over. The French army melts away, leaving thousands of dead and dying on the field. Among the fallen are some of the greatest names in France: the Duke of Lorraine, the Counts of Flanders, Blois, Harcourt and Aumale, the blind King of Bohemia, and hundreds of other nobles. Your losses, by contrast, are minimal, perhaps a few hundred men at most. It's a victory so complete, so one-sided, that messengers carrying the news will be disbelieved until they swear solemn oaths. The following morning you survey the battlefield. The dead lie in heaps where they fell, their blood soaking into the French soil they died defending. Wounded men moan for water or mercy. Camp followers and local peasants pick through the bodies, stripping them of valuables. It's always worse in the daylight, says your son, riding up beside you. His armour is dented and blood-spattered, but he sits tall in the saddle. You fought well yesterday, you tell him, allowing paternal pride to show. England will have a worthy king when my time comes. He nods, accepting the praise as his due. What now, father? Now we make this victory count. The strategic implications of Crécy are enormous. With much of the French nobility dead on the battlefield, Philip VI's ability to raise a new army is severely limited. Northern France lies open to you, but your men are exhausted after months of campaigning. You make a bold decision. Rather than march on Paris, you'll secure a permanent foothold on the French coast. The port city of Calais, just 26 miles from Dover across the Channel, becomes your target. The siege begins on September 3rd, 1346. Unlike a quick climactic battle like Crécy, sieges are slow, grinding affairs. You settle in for the long haul, building a complete temporary town around Calais that your men nickname Newtown. This isn't war, it's construction, grumbles the Earl of Warwick as winter approaches. We're homesteading in France. Patience, Thomas, you reply. Calais will fall, and when it does, England will have a permanent door into France. Winter descends, harsh and bitter. Your men suffer in the cold, but the people of Calais suffer more. Food runs out. There are reports of pets and rats being eaten. Still, the town holds, hoping for relief from Philip VI. In England, meanwhile, events unfold that make your position even stronger. Taking advantage of your absence, the Scots invade northern England in October 1346, urged on by Philip VI. David II, King of Scots, leads a substantial force south. Believing England's strength is depleted with you and your army in France, it's a serious miscalculation. At Neville's Cross near Durham, an English force led by local nobles crushes the Scottish army. King David himself is captured. an extraordinary prize. Now both Scotland and France are on the defensive, their kings humiliated. When news reaches you at Calais, you allow yourself a rare moment of triumph. We have them both now, you tell your council. With David captured and Philip hiding after Crécy, both our enemies are without leadership. The siege of Calais continues through spring and into summer. By July 1347, the situation inside the city is desperate. Citizens are dying of starvation. The commander, Jean de Vienne, finally offers to surrender. You're in no mood for mercy. The siege has cost you nearly a year and enormous expense. You demand that 6 of the leading citizens of Calais must surrender themselves, barefoot and with nooses around their necks, to face execution. When the 6 burghers appear, led by Eustache de Saint-Pierre, they're in pitiful condition, starving, dressed in rags, ready for death. Your nobles expect them to be hanged as an example. But here your queen, Philippa of Hainaut, intervenes. Heavily pregnant, she kneels before you in front of the entire army. My lord, I have crossed dangerous seas to be with you in France, she says, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent camp. I ask only one gift, the lives of these 6 men. It's a carefully staged moment. You appear reluctant but eventually relent, granting the burghers their lives for the love of a woman. In truth, executing them would have been politically unwise, but the show of mercy, credited to your queen, enhances both your reputations. Well played, Northampton murmurs as the grateful burghers are led away. A king must be feared, you reply quietly, but a queen should be loved. On August 3rd, 1347, Calais officially surrenders. You make a bold, controversial decision, expelling most of the native French population and replacing them with English settlers. Calais will become an English town on French soil, a secure bridgehead for future campaigns. The French will never forgive this, warns your Chancellor. They haven't forgiven Crécy either, you reply. At least now we have a fortress from which to greet their displeasure. With Calais secured and your army exhausted after more than a year in France, you negotiate a truce with Philip VI in September 1347. It's meant to last until 1348, but external events will extend it far longer. You return to England in triumph in October 1347, having achieved more in a single campaign than most kings manage in a lifetime. England is ecstatic. You are Edward the Warrior King, victor of Halidon Hill, Slies, and now the legendary Battle of Crécy. They're calling you the new Arthur, says William Montague, Earl of Salisbury, as your ship approaches Dover. A king to rival Longshanks himself. You don't reply, but the comparison to your grandfather pleases you. Edward Thrum cast a long shadow, one you've finally stepped out from. Back in London, you throw yourself into strengthening your realm. The war has been expensive, draining the treasury, but it's also created opportunities. Veterans returning from France bring new skills and experiences. Trade flourishes with your continental allies. In January 1348, you make a decision that will create one of your most lasting legacies. Enthralled by Arthurian legend and inspired by your military successes, you establish the Order of the Garter, a chivalric brotherhood initially consisting of yourself and 25 companions, many veterans of Crécy. The Round Table reborn, comments the Earl of Salisbury during the first ceremony at Windsor. But more practical, you reply with a smile. Arthur's knights sought the Grail. Mine have already found glory in France. The Order's emblem, a blue garter with the motto Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, will become the highest order of chivalry in England, continuing unbroken to the present day. Windsor Castle itself is undergoing massive reconstruction under your direction. The Norman fortress is being transformed into a palace worthy of your ambitions at the staggering cost of $50,000, the most expensive building project undertaken by any medieval English king. Is such expense necessary? Asks your treasurer delicately. A king's buildings speak when he is silent, you reply. Windsor will speak of England's greatness long after we're dust. But as summer approaches in 1348, troubling reports begin to reach England from the continent. A mysterious and deadly disease has appeared in the Mediterranean, killing with terrifying speed and spreading northward. They're calling it the Great Mortality, your Chancellor informs you during a council meeting, or the Black Death, for the colour it turns the dying. Superstitious nonsense, scoffs one of your older advisers. Plague comes and goes. England has weathered such storms before. But this plague is different, more virulent, more deadly than any in living memory. By June, it reaches Bordeaux in southwestern France, where your daughter Joan is travelling for her marriage to Pedro of Castile. The messenger who brings news of her death is hollow-eyed with grief and fear. The princess was taken in days, your grace, he reports. The fever came suddenly, then the swellings appeared in her neck and groin. By the third day she was gone. The loss hits you hard. Joan was 14, the same age you were when you became king. Now she's buried in a hasty grave in Bordeaux, far from home. Queen Philippa weeps openly, but you maintain the composed facade expected of a king. Only later, alone in your chamber, do you allow grief its moment. She was so alive, you tell Philippa that night, your voice tight. So much like you. This plague takes everyone, she replies, her eyes red-rimmed. They say in some villages not a soul remains. By August 1348, the Black Death reaches England's southern coast. Like most medieval people, you have no understanding of disease transmission or prevention. The common belief holds that plague spreads through bad air or as divine punishment. But you're practical enough to take precautions. The court leaves London for less populated areas. You establish quarantine measures as best you can, though they're based on flawed understanding. We stand at the threshold of something terrible, your physician warns as autumn approaches and plague spreads inland from the coast. Looking out from Windsor Castle at the peaceful countryside below, it's hard to imagine the invisible enemy advancing town by town, village by village. But advance it does, leaving devastation in its wake. God tests England as he tests her king, observes the Archbishop of Canterbury solemnly. Then England shall endure, you reply, as her king has endured. The Black Death will test your kingdom as no battle ever could. In the coming months, perhaps a third of England's population will die. The social and economic fabric of the country will strain to breaking point. Yet even this unprecedented catastrophe will become another chapter in your remarkable story of resilience and reinvention. The king who survived a childhood as a puppet, who seized power from his own mother, who transformed warfare at Crécy, will find ways to guide his nation through its darkest hour. As night falls over Windsor, you stand at the window of your private chamber, watching distant torches move along roads soon to carry plague to London. The weight of a nation rests on your shoulders, heavier than any armour, more burdensome than any crown. God save England, you whisper to the darkness. God save us all. London burns, not with fire, but with fever. By winter 1348, the Black Death grips your capital like a demon's hand. Smoke rises from Countless small fires where people burn rosemary and juniper, believing the herbs purify the air. The smell does little to mask the stench of death. "Another 100 dead yesterday, Your Grace," reports your Chancellor. His face is gaunt with exhaustion. The burial grounds overflow. They're digging mass graves outside the walls now. You stand at the window of Windsor Castle, safely removed from the city but not from the responsibility. Unlike your comfortable bed right now, medieval kings had no escape from crisis. No Netflix to distract them, no Twitter to blame others. Just the crushing weight of knowing thousands died while you watched from a distance. And the countryside, you ask, though you already know the answer. Similar reports everywhere, sire, some villages entirely empty. The scope of the disaster exceeds anything in living memory. In the coming months, perhaps 1/3 of England's population will perish. In some places the death toll reaches 50% or higher. Monasteries, where monks live in close quarters, are particularly hard hit. "God's will," murmurs a bishop standing nearby. "Perhaps," you reply, "but God also gave us minds to manage his challenges." Unlike many medieval rulers who respond to crisis with prayer alone, you take practical action. While you can't stop the plague, no one will understand its true cause for centuries, you can address its consequences. The most immediate problem beyond the death toll itself is economic collapse. With so many labourers dead, fields lie untended. Livestock wanders without herdsmen. Crops rot unharvested. The survivors, suddenly in high demand, begin demanding higher wages, much higher. "The peasants grow insolent," complains the Earl of Arundel during a council meeting. "A common labourer who earned 2 pennies a day now demands 8 or 10. It's highway robbery." "They know we need them now," observes William Bohun more pragmatically. "Supply and demand, my friend." The labour crisis threatens to upend the entire social order. Medieval society functions on a rigid hierarchy where everyone knows their place. Suddenly, peasants have leverage. Some even leave their manors without permission to seek better opportunities, technically illegal under feudal law. "Something must be done," insists Arundel, "or England will be turned upside down." In June 1349, you issue a preliminary ordinance to regulate labour, followed in 1351 by a more comprehensive statute of labourers. The measures fix wages at pre-plague levels and prohibit workers from leaving their homes to seek higher pay elsewhere. "They'll hate this," warns your treasurer. "Perhaps," you acknowledge, "but England needs stability now more than revolution." The statute is harsh by modern standards, essentially forcing people to work for less than market rates, but it helps prevent complete economic collapse. More importantly, it strengthens the role of local officials called justices of the peace, who enforce the new rules at the county level. "These JPs will be our eyes and hands in every shire," you explain to your council, "not just for this crisis, but for generations to come." It's a subtle but profound change in governance. Rather than relying solely on sheriffs and lords, you're creating a more standardized local authority. Officials who represent the Crown's interests in every corner of the realm. The office of Justice of the Peace will endure for centuries, eventually spreading to English colonies around the world. That's your particular genius as king, seeing opportunity in crisis, building institutions that outlast emergencies. While the plague ravages the country, you're quietly reforming government in ways that will shape England long after you're gone. Night falls over Windsor. The distant glow of London seems dimmer these days, with so many houses empty, so many businesses closed. You've just finished reading reports from your tax collectors, another grim tally of the plague's impact. The Treasury will feel this for years, says your chamberlain collecting the scrolls, perhaps a decade or more. Then we shall have to find new sources of revenue, you reply, rubbing tired eyes. In 1351, you initiate a major reform of English coinage, introducing gold coins and a new silver piece called the groat. This might seem like a technical change, but it's vital for a medieval economy struggling to recover from plague. Better money means better trade, you explain to merchants in London, many wearing pomanders of herbs to ward off disease, and trade will restore England's strength. By 1352, the first wave of plague has largely passed, though it will return periodically throughout the century. England is changed forever, physically and socially, but has survived. Your steady leadership during the crisis enhances your already formidable reputation. Other kingdoms fractured, observes the Venetian ambassador. France nearly collapsed into civil war, but England endured, as did her king. The Black Death has another unexpected effect on your ongoing conflict with France. The truce negotiated after Crécy, intended to last only until 1348, extends for years as both countries struggle with plague's aftermath. But by 1355, you're ready to resume the war. Philip VI has died, succeeded by his son John II, but your claim to the French throne remains unresolved. The hard-won English foothold at Calais provides a perfect staging ground for a new invasion. One more great campaign, you tell your council, to force the French to recognise our rights once and for all. This time, your strategy involves a two-pronged attack. You'll lead one force across the Channel to northern France, while your son, the Black Prince, now a seasoned commander at 25, will campaign in southwestern France from the Duchy of Aquitaine. Plans are made, ships requisitioned, supplies gathered. The logistics of medieval warfare remain enormously complex, feeding and equipping thousands of men across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. 3 million arrows, reports your quartermaster, reading from his inventory. 30,000 sheaves, enough for 10 battles like Crécy. But as the northern expedition prepares to depart in late autumn of 1355, troubling news arrives from Scotland. Taking advantage of your focus on France, the Scots have resumed raiding across the border. Not again, you sigh. The northern problem has been a constant thorn throughout your reign. Reluctantly, you redirect your expedition to Scotland, leading a winter campaign that reasserts English control over the border region, but delays your French ambitions. Meanwhile, your son, the Black Prince, proceeds with his mission in Aquitaine. Landing in Bordeaux in September 1355, he leads a chevauchée, one of those destructive raids, through southern France, burning and pillaging as he goes. Reports of his progress reach you in early 1356 as you return from Scotland. The Black Prince has proven himself your true heir in military matters, conducting a campaign that shocks French morale but falls short of strategic victory. He's burned towns as far east as Narbonne, reads your messenger from a dispatch, but now returns to Bordeaux for winter quarters. You nod, approving the caution. Winter campaigns are notoriously dangerous. More men often die from cold and disease than enemy action. Better to withdraw and prepare for spring. March 1356. With Scotland temporarily pacified, you resume planning your cross-channel expedition. But even kings cannot control the weather. Spring storms wreak havoc on your assembled fleet at Southampton. Ships damaged, supplies ruined, reports the Admiral, soaking wet from his inspection. We'll need at least a month to repair and restock. The delay proves critical. By the time your fleet is ready, your son has already launched his next campaign from Bordeaux, heading north into central France. The French king, John II, has decided to intercept him personally with an overwhelming force. The prince is outnumbered, warns a breathless messenger, who has ridden day and night from Portsmouth with news. The French king gathers men from all quarters to trap him. You recognize the danger immediately. Your son leads perhaps 6,000 men against John's army of over 10,000. The Black Prince is deep in enemy territory, his supply lines stretch thin, retreat difficult. We must sail immediately, you command. My son needs us. But medieval communication and transportation move at the speed of a horse or sailing ship. By the time you reach Calais in early September, events in central France have already reached their climax. Near the town of Poitiers, your son finds himself cornered by John II's larger army. Unlike at Crécy, where you chose the ground, the Black Prince has been forced to make a stand where circumstance dictated. He'll be thinking of everything you taught him, says the Earl of Warwick, trying to ease your obvious concern as you wait for news in Calais. Let us pray it was enough, you reply. For 3 days, you wait in agonizing suspense. Medieval battles could be decided in hours, but news of them might take days or weeks to travel. Every rider approaching Calais might bring word of triumph or disaster. Finally, on the evening of the 3rd day, a messenger arrives, his horse nearly dead from hard riding. Victory, he gasps before you can even ask. Complete victory at Poitiers. The French king himself is captured. The hall erupts in cheers. You remain still, processing the magnitude of this news. Not only has your son won against overwhelming odds, but he's captured the King of France, an almost unprecedented prize in medieval warfare. Tell me everything, you command when the celebration quiets. The tale unfolds like something from legend. Outnumbered and trapped, the Black Prince positioned his army behind hedges and vineyards that channeled the French advance. Once again, English longbowmen devastated the enemy ranks. When the arrows ran out, it came down to brutal hand-to-hand combat. The prince fought in the thickest press, reports the messenger. Men say he was everywhere at once, his black armour splashed with blood, rallying our troops when they faltered. The decisive moment came when a surprise flanking manoeuvre led by the Gascon captain Jean de Grailly caught the French in disarray. King John fought bravely, reportedly declaring, "If truth were known, name is valour," but was eventually surrounded and forced to surrender. "And my son?" you ask, the father briefly overriding the king. "Unharmed, your grace. He treated the French king with such courtesy that men say John wept to be defeated by so noble a prince." You close your eyes briefly, relief washing over you. When you open them, you're once again Edward the King, not Edward the Father. This changes everything, you tell your commanders. With John captured, France is ours for the taking. The strategic implications are enormous. Like David II of Scotland before him, John VI is now your prisoner. Both your northern and southern enemies are without their kings. England stands ascendant as never before. The Black Prince brings his royal captive to England in May 1357. London erupts in celebration as King John is paraded through the streets, respectfully but unmistakably as a conquered enemy. No English king since the Norman conquest has achieved such a triumph over France. "My son," you greet the prince warmly when he presents himself at Westminster. "You have brought great honour to England." "I remembered your lessons from Crécy, father," he replies, kneeling before you. "Position, patience, and the longbow. Later, in private, you embrace him properly, not as king to prince, but as father to son. I feared for you, you admit, when I heard you were trapped. I feared for myself, he confesses with a wry smile. There were moments when I thought we wouldn't see England again. Yet you prevailed, you say proudly, as I knew you would. With John II safely imprisoned in the Tower of London, later transferred to more comfortable quarters at Windsor, negotiations begin for his release. The initial demands are staggering: full recognition of your claim to the French throne, enormous territorial concessions, and a ransom of 4 million écus. They'll never agree to all this, warns your Chancellor. Of course not, you reply, but we start high and settle for what we truly want. Meanwhile, France spirals toward chaos without its king. The Dauphin, Charles, tries to govern in his father's absence but faces rebellions in Paris and the countryside. A peasant revolt known as the Jacquerie erupts in 1358, with commoners massacring nobles they blame for military failures and high taxes. France tears itself apart, observes Queen Philippa as you read reports together one evening, while England stands united. For now, you caution, but we must be vigilant. What happens there could happen here if we're not careful. The years of John's captivity become a complex diplomatic dance. You balance maximizing advantage against the practical reality that a completely destroyed France would benefit no one, certainly not your claim to rule it. Finally, in 1360, a preliminary agreement is reached. The Treaty of Bretigny, named after the town near Chartres where it's negotiated, represents the peak of English power in the medieval period. Under its terms, John II will be released for the still enormous ransom of 3 million gold crowns. You agree to renounce your claim to the French throne, but in return, you receive full sovereignty over an expanded Aquitaine, plus Calais, Ponthieu, and other territories. No longer will English kings owe fealty to French monarchs for their continental possessions. This is everything we fought for, exults the Earl of Warwick when the terms are announced. Not quite everything. You've given up the claim to be King of France, but it's a diplomatic triumph nonetheless. England now controls nearly a third of modern France, territories that will yield rich tax revenues for years to come. On October 24th, 1360, you ratify the treaty, bringing the first phase of what later historians will call the 100 Years' War to a successful conclusion. After decades of conflict dating back to your father's reign, England stands victorious and greatly expanded. That night, in the privacy of your chamber at Westminster, you allow yourself a rare moment of pure satisfaction. The boy king who was once a puppet has transformed England into the dominant power in Western Europe. Grandfather would be proud, you tell Philippa, referring to Edward thus, whose shadow loomed so large over your early years. He would be jealous, she corrects you with a smile. You've already achieved more than Longshanks ever did. It's true, though you'd never say it yourself. Your grandfather conquered Wales and hammered Scotland but failed to hold it. You've secured the Scottish border, won unprecedented concessions from France, reformed English governance, and guided the nation through the apocalypse of the Black Death. At 47, you stand at the pinnacle of your reign, respected throughout Europe, beloved in England, with healthy sons to secure the succession. The Black Prince has proven himself worthy to follow you. Your other sons, Lionel of Antwerp, John of Gaunt, and Edmund of Langley, hold important positions in government and military affairs. For the first time in decades, you can afford to think beyond crisis and war to legacy. What kind of England will you leave when your time comes? How will future generations remember Edward III? The next decade, the 1360s, will be the most peaceful of your long reign, a time to consolidate gains, reform administration, patronize arts and architecture. Windsor Castle's reconstruction continues, transforming it from a fortress into a palace that proclaims English power and sophistication. You've already created the Order of the Garter, establishing England's reputation for chivalric culture. Now you'll turn to legal reforms, trade expansion, and even the language itself, promoting the use of English instead of French in law courts and government. England is transformed, Philippa says softly, taking your hand, and you with it. From puppet to warrior to statesman, the evolution seems complete, yet challenges still lie ahead. The Treaty of Bretigny will face implementation problems. France will eventually recover and seek revenge. The plague will return periodically. But for now, in the autumn of 1360, you've earned this moment of triumph. The England you rule is stronger, more centralized, and more confident than the fractured kingdom you inherited. As you fall asleep that night, the weight of the crown temporarily lifted, you allow yourself to dream not of past glories, but future possibilities. The second half of your reign stretches before you, less dramatic perhaps than the first, but no less consequential for the nation you've spent a lifetime shaping. Morning light filters through the stained glass windows of Westminster, casting multicoloured patterns across the council chamber. You're still Edward III, now in your late 40s, and for the first time in your reign, England enjoys genuine peace. The year is 1362, and you're about to change how your entire kingdom communicates. My lords, you address the council, from this day forward, all pleas in my courts of law shall be conducted in English, not French. The Chancellor nearly drops his quill. Your Grace, French has been the language of law since the conquest, nearly 300 years. And English has been the language of England far longer, you counter. Why should common people stand before judges and not understand the words that decide their fate? This isn't just linguistic preference, it's nation building. Ever since William the Conqueror seized England in 1066, a strange linguistic divide has split the country. Norman French for the nobility and government, English for common folk. By officially elevating English, you're forging a more unified identity. The French will see this as another insult, warns a councillor. You smile slightly. Good. When Parliament opens later that year, the Chancellor's address is delivered in English for the first time. It's a subtle revolution, one whose effect will echo for centuries. You've set England on a path where its unique language, a hybrid of Germanic roots and Norman French, will become its strength, not its division. It just makes sense, you explain to Queen Philippa that evening as you walk through the palace gardens. The flowers are in full bloom, their scent heavy in the summer air. How can England truly be one nation when its rulers speak one language and its people another? The 1360s are your decade of peace and reform. The Treaty of Bretigny has secured your continental possessions. Scotland remains quiet after the capture of David II. With breathing room from constant warfare, you turn your attention inward to the machinery of English governance. The wool staple needs reform, you announced to Parliament in 1362. All exports shall pass through Calais. This reorganisation of England's most valuable export, wool, creates a controlled market that benefits both the Crown and English merchants. It's the kind of administrative change that doesn't inspire epic poems, but builds real national wealth and power. The peaceful years also allow you to focus on family. Your children are grown now, taking on responsibilities of their own. Your eldest, Edward the Black Prince, administers Aquitaine almost as a separate kingdom. Your second surviving son, Lionel of Antwerp, you've sent to Ireland as your representative. Ireland has been at least nominally under English control since the 1100s, but only the eastern portion, known as the Pale, is truly governed from London. Irish lords rule the western regions, often in open defiance of English authority. The Irish situation requires a permanent solution, you tell Lionel before his departure. Not conquest, but firm governance. In 1366, Lionel presides over a parliament at Kilkenny that issues a series of laws designed to maintain English culture and authority in Ireland. The Statutes of Kilkenny prohibit the English settlers from adopting Irish customs, language, or intermarrying with the native Irish. This will keep the English of Ireland English, Lionel writes to you afterward. Without it, they'd become more Irish than the Irish themselves. The statutes are harsh by modern standards, essentially creating an apartheid system, but they succeed in preserving English control in Ireland for centuries to come. It's another example of your gift for institution building, for creating systems that outlast your direct rule. But not all is peaceful governance and family affairs. In 1362, your beloved Queen Philippa falls ill. By 1368, it's clear she's dying. "Stay with me," she whispers one summer evening, her hand frail in yours. After 30 years of marriage, extraordinary for royal unions which were typically political and loveless, you've raised 13 children together and weathered countless crises. Until the end, you promise, your voice thick with emotion that you rarely display in public. She dies on August 15th, 1369, at Windsor Castle. You're at her bedside, as promised. Her last request is that you not remarry, that you be buried beside her when your time comes. Your grief is profound but private. Kings don't have the luxury of extended mourning, and as if sensing your personal weakness, your enemies choose this moment to strike. Charles V of France, son of John II, has spent the decade rebuilding French power and waiting for an opportunity to reverse the humiliations of Crécy and Poitiers. When a succession dispute arises in Castile, modern Spain, he seizes the chance to indirectly challenge English interest by backing one claimant while you support another. The French king moves against us in Spain, reports John of Gaunt, your third son, who has married into the Castilian royal family and claims the throne through his wife. Then we move against him in France, you reply. The treaty is broken. Just like that, the peace of the 1360s ends. In 1369, Charles V declares the Duchy of Aquitaine forfeit, essentially tearing up the Treaty of Bretigny. You respond by reasserting your claim to the French throne. The 100 Years' War resumes as if it had merely paused for breath. But this phase of the conflict will be different. You're older now, nearly 60, and for the first time in your life your health begins to fail. The first serious illness strikes in 1369, a mysterious ailment that leaves you weakened and occasionally confused. "My father needs rest," the Black Prince tells the council when you suffer a particularly bad episode. "The kingdom's business can wait." But of course, it can't. Medieval kingship is relentlessly demanding, an endless procession of decisions, ceremonies, and crises. There are no weekends, no vacations, no sick days. The crown weighs heaviest when the head beneath it aches. You recover enough to resume governance, but you're changed. The man who once led cavalry charges and fought hand-to-hand at Crécy now struggles sometimes to follow council debates. Your sons increasingly take on military and administrative responsibilities. the Black Prince leads a major expedition to France in 1370, but this campaign lacks the brilliance of Poitiers. The French, under Charles V, have learned the bitter lessons of previous defeats. They avoid pitched battles, withdraw before English, advances and harass supply lines, a strategy of exhaustion rather than confrontation. They won't fight, the prince complains in his letters to you. They simply melt away, then reappear once we've passed. Patience, you counsel in reply, though you know how frustrating such warfare can be. They must fight eventually, or concede the land entirely. But the French have found a third option: attrition. They are content to let English armies march through empty countryside, capturing towns that are quickly retaken once the main force moves on. It's a grueling, inconclusive form of war that drains the treasury and exhausts the troops. By 1371, the situation has deteriorated further. Your son, the Black Prince, falls seriously ill with dysentery during his campaign. Like many medieval commanders, disease proves a more dangerous enemy than any French knight. He must return to England, you tell his wife Joan, when reports of his condition reach Westminster. France can wait. His health cannot. The prince returns, but he's a shadow of the warrior who triumphed at Poitiers. Pale, thin, subject to fevers and chronic pain, he will never campaign again. England has lost its greatest military commander just when he's most needed. As your own health continues to decline, and your heir's fails even more dramatically, your third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, increasingly steps into the breach. Tall, capable and ambitious, John becomes the de facto ruler of England during your periodic illnesses. Lancaster runs the kingdom while the king dreams of past glories, a courtier is heard to remark. Not quite quietly enough. He's banished from court immediately, but the damage is done. Whispers spread. Edward the Great is becoming Edward the Feeble. Such whispers wound your pride, but there's enough truth in them to sting. You're increasingly disconnected from daily governance, your legendary mental sharpness dulled by age and infirmity. Episodes of confusion become more frequent. There are days when you struggle to recognize familiar faces. Father, John of Gaunt says gently during one such episode, "It's me, John, your son." You blink, clarity slowly returning. "Of course, John, forgive me." The mind wanders sometimes. "There is nothing to forgive," he replies, but you see the concern in his eyes. The war in France continues to go poorly. By 1373, John of Gaunt leads a great chevauchée from Calais through eastern France to Bordeaux, a march of over 500 miles through enemy territory. It's an epic feat of logistics and endurance, but strategically almost meaningless. The French shadow the English army but refuse decisive battle, and the raid leaves no permanent gains. "We killed their peasants and burned their farms," John reports upon his return, "but we're no closer to victory." The truth, though few dare speak it openly, is that England is losing the war your brilliant generalship once dominated. The French have adapted. The element of surprise is gone. The longbow is still lethal, but useless if the enemy won't stand and fight. By 1375, financial strain and military stalemate force England to the negotiating table. The Treaty of Bruges establishes a truce, but it's nothing like the triumphant Treaty of Bretigny. This is a pause, not a victory, a tacit admission that England can no longer impose its will on France. The treaty is deeply unpopular at home, seen as surrender of hard-won gains. Parliament, which you've empowered throughout your reign by consulting it regularly for taxation, begins to show teeth, criticising your councillors and demanding reforms. This domestic discontent culminates in the so-called Good Parliament of 1376, an assembly determined to address grievances about taxation, corruption, and the declining war effort. It's an institution you've strengthened, turning against policies conducted in your name, though increasingly without your direct involvement. They act as if the king were already dead, complains one of your few remaining original councillors. Perhaps, John of Gaunt replies coolly, because he is often absent even when present. It's a harsh assessment, but not entirely wrong. Your periods of lucidity grow shorter, the episodes of confusion more frequent. Modern doctors might diagnose a series of small strokes, each taking another piece of the formidable mind that outmanoeuvred Mortimer, won at Crecy, and reformed English governance. The greatest blow comes on June 8, 1376. Your eldest son and heir, Edward the Black Prince, dies at Westminster after years of illness. He's just 45, younger than you were at Crecy. England loses not just its greatest military commander, but its future king. The prince's 10-year-old son, Richard of Bordeaux, becomes the new heir to the throne. But a child king means a regency, and regencies mean power struggles. The political stability you've maintained for decades suddenly looks fragile. You're present at your son's funeral at Canterbury Cathedral, but witnesses describe you as confused, needing support to stand, apparently not fully comprehending the magnitude of the loss. The mighty Edward III, who has ruled for nearly 50 years, is fading before the kingdom's eyes. The king spoke at council today, reports a Venetian observer later that summer, but his words wandered like leaves in the wind. The Duke of Lancaster answered for him, as has become common. In September 1376, a large abscess develops, causing you intense pain and further deterioration. Though it bursts in February 1377, bringing some relief, the infection has taken a permanent toll. Your physicians exchange grave looks. The end is approaching. Spring comes, then early summer. You spend your final days at Sheen Palace near London, attended by your surviving children. John of Gaunt manages affairs of state, bringing you documents to sign when you're lucid enough to understand them. On June 21st, 1377, with summer sunlight streaming through the windows of your chamber, your breathing becomes laboured, your sons are summoned. The Archbishop brings the last rites. "My lords," you manage to whisper, a final moment of clarity breaking through the fog. "I have reigned long enough." They are your last recorded words. As evening approaches, Edward III, who transformed England from chaotic, invaded backwater to European superpower, closes his eyes for the final time. You're 64 years old. You've ruled for 50 years and 4 months, one of the longest reigns in English history. You've led armies to victory at Halidon Hill, Sleaze, and Crecy. You've reformed government, language, and law. You've created the Order of the Garter and rebuilt Windsor Castle. You've weathered the Black Death and guided England through its darkest hours. When news of your death spreads through London the following day, the city erupts in genuine grief. Bells toll across the capital. People gather in streets and churches to mourn not just a king but a national hero. England's own Arthur, returned as promised in the nation's hour of need. Your funeral procession winds through London streets lined with weeping subjects. Your face remains uncovered on the bier, allowing the people one last look at the king who defined their era. 24 knights in black carry your body, followed by your sons and the highest nobles of the realm. The chronicler Jean Froissart, who chronicled much of your reign, writes, "To witness and hear the grief of the people, Their sobs and screams and lamentations on that day would have rendered anyone's heart. You're buried at Westminster Abbey, beside your beloved Philippa as promised. The tomb is magnificent, befitting a king whose reign transformed a nation. Above it stands a gilt bronze effigy, showing you not as the confused old man of your final years, but as you were in your prime, the warrior king of Crecy, England's champion. Your 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, succeeds you as king. The challenges he'll face, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, might have been insurmountable even for you in your prime. But that's a story for another time. For now, as the summer of 1377 fades into autumn, England mourns its greatest medieval king, the boy puppet who became a legend, the ruler who transformed a kingdom into an empire, the man who began as Edward of Windsor and died as Edward the Great. Your legacy lives on not just in grand victories or territorial gains, but in institutions that endure for centuries: Parliament, justices of the peace, legal reforms, the wool trade, the Order of the Garter. Even as your military conquests eventually slip away, the England you forged remains, centralized, confident, with a unique identity separate from the continent. In the quiet of Westminster Abbey, as candles burn beside your tomb and monks chant prayers for your soul, the earthly remains of Edward III rest. But the nation you shaped continues, following the path you set during 50 remarkable years as England's greatest medieval king. The marble feels cool beneath your fingertips as you trace the carved outline of Edward III's tomb at Westminster Abbey. 7 centuries has passed since his death, yet his presence still dominates this sacred space. The massive stone sarcophagus, topped with his gilt bronze effigy, speaks of power even in death. Did you know, the elderly guide says, noticing your interest, that for nearly 200 years after Edward's death, English kings would still claim the throne of France? His legacy was that powerful. You nod, imagining how different Europe might look if Edward's claim had stuck permanently. The entire map redrawn, England and France united under one crown, history taking an entirely different path. But what makes a king truly great? What separates the merely competent from the legendary? What made Edward III special among the dozens of monarchs who have worn England's crown? The answers lie not just in battles won or territories conquered, but in institutions built, reforms enacted, and cultural shifts that outlast any single reign. Edward's greatness wasn't just what he did, but what he built that endured long after him. Take the English longbow, that simple weapon of yew wood that devastated the French at Crécy and Poitiers. Edward didn't invent it, but he revolutionized its use, creating the first truly effective infantry-based army in medieval Europe. Before Edward, explains a military historian at the Royal Armouries, carefully handling a replica longbow, European warfare was dominated by heavily armoured knights. After him, no general could ignore the common archer. The longbow itself eventually became obsolete, replaced by firearms. But Edward's key innovation, that commoners with ranged weapons could defeat aristocrats in armour, permanently changed warfare. The democratic implications were profound, even if they weren't recognised at the time. He created what we might call the first truly national army, the historian continues. Not just nobles and their retainers, but ordinary Englishmen fighting for England, not just for their local lord. This was nation-building at its most fundamental, creating institutions that unified people across social classes around a shared identity. Edward did the same with language, law, and governance. By promoting English over French in the courts, he gave common people access to justice in their own tongue for the first time since the Norman conquest. By establishing the justice of the peace system, he created local governance that represented the crown's authority in every corner of the realm. Edward understood something crucial, says a professor of medieval history at Oxford, seated in his book-lined office, that kingdoms are built from the ground up, not just imposed from above. His creation of the Order of the Garter in 1348 seems, at first glance, to contradict this, an exclusive knightly brotherhood limited to the king and 25 companions. But it served a vital political purpose, binding the highest nobles directly to the crown through personal loyalty and shared chivalric ideals. It was psychology as much as ceremony, the professor explains. Edward gave the nobility something they craved: exclusivity, prestige, proximity to the king, while ensuring their loyalty to him personally. The order endures to this day as Britain's highest chivalric order. Its motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, still adorns royal insignia and state documents. Walking through Windsor Castle, you can still see the chapel where the original Knights of the Garter gathered. Hard to believe, a tour guide tells visitors, but those wooden stalls with the brass nameplates, they're the direct descendants of Edward III's original seats for his knights. Nearly 700 years of continuous tradition. Few monarchs in history have created institutions with such longevity, but Edward's greatest legacy may have been something less tangible: his role in forging a distinctly English identity separate from continental Europe. Before Edward, England's nobility was essentially Franco-Norman, speaking French, owning lands in France, considering themselves part of a cross-channel aristocracy. After him, they were undeniably English, even as they maintained French connections. The 100 Years' War forced people to choose sides, explains a curator at the British Museum, showing a case of 14th century artefacts. You couldn't be both English and French anymore. Edward didn't just fight for territory, he fought for the idea of England as something distinct. This emerging national identity expressed itself in countless ways: language, law, customs, even clothing. By the end of Edward's reign, English literature was flourishing with writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, whose Canterbury Tales captured a distinctly English society in the vernacular language. Without Edward's promotion of English in government, would Chaucer have written in English rather than French, asks a literary scholar. Maybe eventually, but Edward accelerated the process dramatically. Even Parliament, though it existed before Edward, gained new importance during his reign. His constant need for money to finance wars meant frequent parliaments, where representatives had to approve new taxes. Each meeting strengthened the institution's role. He probably didn't intend to create parliamentary democracy, chuckles a constitutional historian, but by regularly consulting Parliament for funding, he established the principle that the king needed consent for taxation. That becomes extremely important later. Not that Edward was some enlightened democrat, far from it. He was a medieval king who believed absolutely in his divine right to rule, but his pragmatism led him to build systems that eventually evolved into more democratic institutions. The fascinating thing about Edward, observes a psychologist specializing in leadership, is how he transformed himself at each stage of his life. From powerless puppet king to warrior to nation builder to elder statesman. That's extraordinarily rare. This capacity for reinvention helped Edward overcome setbacks that might have destroyed lesser rulers. When Scotland seemed lost after the disaster of Bannockburn during his father's reign, Edward regrouped and reasserted English control. When the Black Death killed a third of his subjects, he stabilised the economy with the Statute of Labourers. He was adaptable in a way medieval rulers rarely were, says a biographer who has spent decades studying Edward's life. He could admit when tactics weren't working and try something new, a surprisingly modern trait. Yet for all his achievements, Edward's reputation has fluctuated wildly across the centuries. In the Victorian era, historians questioned whether his reign was truly successful, imposing their 19th century moral values on a 14th century king. The Victorians couldn't separate warfare from morality, explains a historian of historiography. They saw Edward's French wars as wasteful and pointless because they didn't result in permanent conquest. They missed the nation building that happened as a result. More recent historians like Ian Mortimer and William Ormrod have restored Edward's reputation, evaluating him on his own terms rather than anachronistic standards. The modern consensus views him as one of England's most consequential monarchs, perhaps the most successful of the medieval period. If you're looking for comparisons, suggests the Oxford professor, think of Augustus in Rome, another ruler who found his realm in chaos and left it stable and institutionally sound, or Charlemagne, who built systems that long outlasted his personal rule. What about other English kings? How does Edward measure up against figures like Henry V, Elizabeth, or Victoria? Henry V was more spectacular in battle but died young without consolidating his gains, says a specialist in royal history. Elizabeth III was arguably more culturally significant but inherited institutions Edward helped create. Victoria presided over an empire that stemmed partly from the nation Edward built. Even his grandfather, Edward thus Longshanks, while formidable, lacks the complete package of military, administrative and cultural achievements that Edward III assembled. The case for Edward III as England's greatest medieval king is strong, concludes the biographer. 50 years of mostly successful rule, innovative warfare, institutional development, cultural patronage, and remarkable adaptability. Who else checks all those boxes? Of course, medieval kingship came with moral compromises unacceptable to modern sensibilities. Edward's military campaigns included what we would now call war crimes, deliberate targeting of civilian populations through chevauchées that destroyed crops and livelihoods. The Statute of Labourers essentially forced people to work for artificially low wages. You can't apply modern ethics to medieval actions, warns the Oxford professor. Edward lived in a world where might made right, where kings were believed to rule by divine appointment, where the common people were viewed as resources rather than citizens. Understanding Edward III means understanding the medieval mind, a worldview where chivalry could coexist with brutality, where religious devotion didn't preclude political calculation, where family loyalty battled constantly with political necessity. He was complex, says a psychological historian. The man who ordered mass destruction in France also created beautiful architecture at Windsor. The king who imprisoned his own mother also remained devoted to his wife Philippa for decades, in an era when royal marriages were rarely love matches. This complexity makes Edward more interesting, not less. His contradictions humanize him across the centuries. We can imagine the teenager plotting against Mortimer, the young king leading charges at Halidon Hill, the grieving father at the Black Prince's funeral. I've studied him for 30 years, admits the biographer, and he still surprises me. Just when you think you understand Edward, you find another layer. Perhaps his most remarkable achievement was maintaining internal stability throughout his long reign. Between 1330, when he seized power from Mortimer, and his death in 1377, England experienced no major rebellions or civil wars, extraordinary for medieval Europe. Compare that to France during the same period, suggests a comparative historian. Multiple rebellions, the Jacquerie peasant revolt, noble factions constantly fighting each other. Or look at Edward's successor, Richard II, who faced the peasants' revolt just 4 years after Edward's death. This stability didn't happen by accident. Edward balanced competing interests, kept powerful nobles invested in his projects, and maintained his personal authority without becoming tyrannical. He understood the art of medieval kingship better than almost any contemporary ruler. He knew when to be harsh and when to show mercy, explains the biographer, when to lead from the front at Crécy and when to delegate to the Black Prince at Poitiers, when to demand Parliament's support and when to compromise. Even his handling of succession, so often a flashpoint in medieval kingdoms, showed foresight. His sons were given important responsibilities and territories, but kept loyal to the crown. The Black Prince was being groomed for kingship long before Edward's death. The tragedy, says the royal historian, is that the Black Prince died before his father. Edward's careful succession planning collapsed with his son's death. The king's final decline, those confusing years of stroke-induced mental deterioration, cast a shadow over the end of his reign. But they don't diminish his achievements during the preceding decades. Think of it this way, suggests the psychologist. Even the greatest athletes eventually lose a step. The greatest minds eventually slow down. Why would kings be different? Judge Edward by his prime, not his twilight. Walking through the Tower of London, you can still see evidence of Edward's impact. Additions he made to the fortress, places where he held prisoners like John the Hen of France, weapons similar to those his armies carried. The tower's yeoman warders, beefeaters, still wear uniforms that evolved from 14th century designs. Edward is everywhere once you know what to look for, says a yeoman warder, resplendent in his scarlet and gold uniform. The heraldry, the badges, the institutions, they all have his fingerprints on them. At Windsor Castle, his presence is even more palpable. The round tower, much of St. George's Chapel, the layout of the upper ward, all reflect Edward's vision. He transformed Windsor from a functional fortress into a statement of royal power and sophistication. He spent the equivalent of about $50 million in today's money on Windsor, a guide explains to astonished tourists. That's how important architecture was to his vision of kingship. In London's streets, look up at pub signs bearing names like the Garter or the Golden Lion, echoes of Edward's heraldry and institutions. Visit the courts of justice and remember Edward's promotion of English law. Hear Big Ben chime and recall that Edward installed one of the first public clocks in England at Westminster. He's woven into the fabric of Britain, observes a cultural historian. Most people don't realise how many aspects of British identity trace back to his reign. Even the modern relationship between Britain and Europe has echoes of Edward's time. His claim to the French throne represented one vision of Britain's European role, directly involved in continental affairs, asserting British interests abroad. The alternative vision, Britain as a separate island nation with its own distinct identity, also emerged during his reign. 700 years later, and we're still debating the same fundamental question, notes a political scientist. What is Britain's relationship to Europe? Edward would recognise the arguments on both sides. As the sun sets over Westminster Abbey, casting long shadows across Edward's tomb, it's worth pondering not just what he achieved, but how. In an age of absolute monarchy, how did one man leave such an indelible mark? Leadership, says the psychology professor simply, true leadership isn't just about power, it's about vision, adaptability, and building something larger than yourself. Edward had all three. From a 14-year-old puppet to England's greatest medieval king, the transformation seems almost mythical. Yet the evidence of Edward's impact surrounds us, tangible in stone and parchment, in language and law, in institutions that still function today. If you want to see Edward III's monument, the elderly guide at Westminster says, quoting Christopher Wren's famous epitaph, "Look around you." Not just at his tomb, magnificent though it is, but at England itself, a nation whose identity, governance, and place in the world were profoundly shaped by 50 remarkable years under Edward III. Night has fallen over London. The Thames flows dark and silent past the Houses of Parliament, structures that wouldn't exist without Edward III's elevation of that institution. Big Ben strikes the hour, its sound carrying across a city whose foundations were shaped by a king who died over 640 years ago. What's the true measure of greatness? Is it conquest, wealth, cultural flourishing, or perhaps longevity, the ability to create something that outlasts yourself? By any measure, Edward III's impact on England was profound, but to truly understand his significance, we need to place him in the context of those who came before and after. Think about the flow of English history, suggests a professor emeritus of medieval studies, his office walls lined with books accumulated over a 50-year career. Before Edward, England was still essentially a Norman-French kingdom grafted onto Anglo-Saxon roots. After him, it was unmistakably English. The professor leans forward in his chair, hands animated as he speaks. William the Conqueror established Norman rule. Henry II created a workable legal system. Edward Fanter Longshanks reformed administration, but Edward III, he forged a national identity. This transformation wasn't just cultural but institutional. Under Edward, Parliament evolved from an occasional gathering into a regular feature of governance. The courts began using English rather than French. The wool trade was systematised through the Calais staple, creating economic foundations that would power England for centuries. Modern nations need three things, the professor continues: a shared identity, functional institutions, and economic strength. Edward built all three. That's why I consider him England's greatest medieval king. But not everyone agrees with this assessment. Walking through the British Museum's medieval gallery, a different historian offers an alternative perspective. Edward was certainly consequential, she acknowledges, gesturing toward a display of 14th century artefacts. But we shouldn't romanticize him. The 100 Years' War was catastrophically expensive. His claim to the French throne was legally dubious, and his military innovations led to unimaginable suffering. She pauses before a replica of an English longbow. This weapon revolutionized warfare, yes, but remember what it was used for: killing French peasant conscripts by the thousands. We call it chivalry and glory now. They called it terror then. This tension between admiration for Edward's achievements and recognition of their human cost defines modern scholarship on his reign. Unlike Victorian historians who simply condemned medieval warfare as barbaric, or earlier chroniclers who celebrated it uncritically, today's approach acknowledges the complexity. Edward was a man of his time, observes a military historian at Sandhurst. Judging him by modern ethical standards makes no more sense than criticising him for not using gunpowder effectively. The technology wasn't there. Neither was the moral framework we take for granted. What's undeniable is Edward's excellence within the parameters of medieval kingship. He excelled at what his era valued: martial prowess, strategic thinking, maintenance of noble loyalty, and effective governance. By the standards of the 14th century, he was the complete package. Compare him to his contemporaries, suggests the Sandhurst historian. While Edward was winning at Crecy, Philip VI was fleeing the battlefield. While Edward was building Windsor Castle, European monarchs were bankrupting their treasuries on vanity projects. While Edward's sons were leading armies, the French succession was in constant crisis. This comparison extends beyond his own time. Few English monarchs can match Edward's combination of military success, institutional development, and cultural patronage. Henry V won brilliantly at Agincourt but died young. Elizabeth Thurn presided over a cultural golden age but avoided direct military leadership. Victoria reigned even longer, but as a constitutional monarch with limited direct power. The closest comparison might be Alfred the Great, muses a specialist in Anglo-Saxon England. Both found their kingdoms in crisis. Both built institutions that outlasted them. Both emphasized English identity and language. But Alfred worked on a much smaller canvas, just Wessex initially, not a nascent empire. As for Edward's imperial ambitions, his claim to France, his interventions in Scotland and Ireland, they point toward England's future as a global power. Though his continental possessions eventually slipped away, he established the idea that English interests extended beyond the island's shores. The British Empire begins conceptually with Edward III, argues an imperial historian controversially. Not in structure, but in mindset. The belief that English power and interest should project outward, that England should be a European and eventually global player rather than an insular kingdom. This legacy is double-edged in the modern world, where imperial history generates heated debate. But what's clear is that Edward's vision of England was expansive rather than isolationist, an orientation that would define British history for centuries. Here's the thing about truly consequential historical figures, says a philosopher of history over coffee at the British Library. They don't just change their own time. They change how future generations think, often in ways they couldn't possibly have anticipated. He gestures to the library around him, where researchers quietly examine documents spanning millennia. Edward couldn't have known that his promotion of English would eventually produce Shakespeare, or that his parliamentary consultations would evolve into democratic governance, or that his Statute of Labourers would create legal precedents still studied by law students today. But they did. This ripple effect, the long tail of historical influence, is what separates merely successful rulers from transformative ones. Edward III falls decidedly in the latter category, having shaped English development in ways that continue to resonate. Walk into any courtroom in England, notes a legal historian. The proceedings are in English because Edward III declared they should be. That's not just a procedural detail. It means justice is conducted in the language people actually speak, a fundamental principle of accessibility that began with his reforms. Similar examples abound in governance, military structure, education, and culture. When the modern British monarch invests a new Knight of the Garter, they're participating in a ceremony essentially unchanged since Edward founded the order nearly 700 years ago. When Parliament votes on taxation, they're following a constitutional principle Edward III helped establish. Institutions are the connective tissue of history, says a political scientist specializing in state formation. Long after personalities fade and specific events are forgotten, institutions continue shaping behaviour and outcomes. Edward III was an institution builder par excellence. This gift for creating durable systems partly explains why Edward succeeded where others failed. Medieval kingship was inherently personalised. Power concentrated in an individual whose death often triggered crisis. By embedding his authority in institutions, Edward created stability that outlasted his personal rule. It's the difference between sandcastles and cathedrals, observes an architectural historian appropriately. Most medieval kings built impressive structures that washed away with the next tide of history. Edward built foundations deep enough to support centuries of additional construction. Even Edward's famous grandeur, the elaborate ceremonies, the magnificent tournaments, the splendour of his court, served institutional purposes. They weren't mere vanity, but tools for binding the nobility to the crown through shared rituals and values. Medieval power wasn't just about force, explains a cultural anthropologist. It was about creating frameworks of meaning that legitimized authority. Edward understood this instinctively. His pageantry wasn't separate from his governance. It was governance through spectacle. Perhaps most remarkably, Edward achieved his transformations despite multiple catastrophes that would have broken lesser rulers. The Black Death killed a third of his subjects, an almost unimaginable demographic collapse. The economic consequences were severe, with labour shortages threatening to unravel the feudal system. Crisis reveals character, notes a disaster historian. Edward's response to the plague, pragmatic, systematic, focused on stability, tells us more about his kingship than any victory celebration. His statute of labourers, though harsh by modern standards, prevented economic meltdown at a critical moment. By controlling wages and fixing prices, it maintained social order during a period when the entire medieval system might have collapsed. It's like emergency powers during wartime, suggests an economic historian. Not ideal in normal circumstances, but potentially necessary in extremis. Without the statute, England might have faced complete breakdown, mass migration, abandoned villages, food system collapse. This capacity to navigate between ideal and practical, between aspiration and reality, defined Edward's approach to kingship. He was a medieval ruler who understood the art of the possible. That's why he succeeded where his father failed so catastrophically, explains a psychologist who studies leadership. Edward III pursued personal gratification regardless of political cost. Edward III aligned his actions with political necessity, even when it meant personal sacrifice. The contrast between father and son couldn't be starker. Edward II's reign ended in forced abdication, imprisonment, and probable murder. Edward III's concluded with national mourning for a king widely regarded as England's greatest. Imagine the psychological impact, the leadership psychologist continues. Growing up watching your father's disastrous rule, seeing the consequences of poor kingship firsthand. Edward III essentially developed a perfect counterexample to follow. Whatever his father did, do the opposite. This early education in failure may explain Edward's remarkable maturity even as a young king. When he seized power from Mortimer at 18, he already demonstrated judgment beyond his years. By 21, at Halidon Hill, he was reshaping warfare. By 33 at Crecy, he had established himself as Europe's premier military leader. He was decades ahead of his contemporaries, observes a developmental psychologist. While other young nobles were still playing at knights, Edward was reinventing what knighthood meant through the order of the Garter. This blend of traditional values with innovative application characterized Edward's entire approach. He embraced chivalric ideals but deployed them through new institutions. He maintained feudal hierarchies but created novel roles within them, like the expanded justice of the peace system. Edward was conservative and revolutionary simultaneously, suggests a political theorist. He preserved the best elements of existing systems while reforming their inefficiencies. That's incredibly difficult to balance. Most rulers either change too little or too much. This talent for calibrated transformation explains why Edward's changes proved so durable. Rather than imposing entirely new systems that might trigger resistance, he evolved existing institutions in ways that seemed natural extensions. It's like he understood institutional path dependency centuries before it was theorized, notes a sociologist. He recognized that successful reform works with historical gravity, not against it. Small adjustments compound over time into major changes. Consider Parliament. Edward didn't invent it. Assemblies of nobles had advised English kings for generations. But by consulting Parliament regularly for taxation, he established precedents that gradually transformed it from occasional advisory body to essential governing institution. He created habits that became customs, customs that became traditions, traditions that became laws, explains a constitutional historian. That's how lasting change happens, not through proclamation but through practiced repetition, until new patterns seem inevitable. Even Edward's military innovations followed this pattern. The longbow existed before him, but he systematized its use, trained archers nationally, and integrated them into battle tactics alongside dismounted men-at-arms. These incremental improvements compounded into the revolutionary victories at Crécy and Poitiers. Evolution, not revolution, summarizes a military strategist. Edward didn't discard traditional elements like heavily armored knights. He repositioned them within new systems that maximize their effectiveness while minimizing their vulnerabilities. This adaptive approach served Edward throughout his long reign. When tactics that worked against Scotland proved ineffective in France, he adjusted. When the Black Death devastated England's population, he created new economic frameworks. When political opposition emerged late in his reign, he negotiated rather than crushed. Adaptability is the supreme survival trait, observes an evolutionary biologist with an interest in history. Edward exemplified it at a societal level, constantly recalibrating governance to match changing conditions while maintaining core stability. Had the Black Prince survived his father, Edward's achievements might have been even more securely established. The heir had already proven himself militarily and administratively. Instead, Edward's grandson Richard II inherited at age 10, leading to precisely the kind of regency crisis Edward himself had experienced. The greatest irony, suggests a specialist in royal succession, is that Edward's reign began and ended with a child king, first himself, then his grandson. The difference is that Edward overcame his disadvantaged start through extraordinary talent. Richard couldn't match his grandfather's gifts and eventually lost his throne. Richard's deposition in 1399 triggered decades of instability, ultimately culminating in the Wars of the Roses. Yet even this upheaval demonstrates Edward III's impact, as most combatants were his descendants through different lines, fighting over the kingdom he had made worth fighting for. Edward created a crown worth having, notes a specialist in royal authority. Before him, the monarchy was fragile, as his father discovered. After him, it was the supreme prize in English politics, with powers and prestige Edward had painstakingly constructed. As night deepens over London, the city Edward knew gradually reveals itself beneath the modern metropolis. The towers' ancient stones, the bends in the Thames, the street patterns established when Edward walked these paths. London has grown exponentially since Edward's time, from perhaps 50,000 inhabitants to nearly 9 million. Yet his fingerprints remain visible in the capital's geography, institutions and identity. The City of London still operates under governance structures dating to his reign. Westminster remains the seat of Parliament as it was under Edward. Cities have memories longer than people, muses an urban historian, watching night traffic flow past medieval walls. They encode decisions made centuries ago into daily patterns their inhabitants rarely notice. Edward shaped London's DNA. This physical persistence mirrors Edward's institutional legacy. Just as his urban planning decisions still influence modern London's layout, his governance innovations continue structuring British political life. The monarchy, parliament, courts, local government, all bear imprints of Edward's shaping hand. If England were a palimpsest, suggests a literary scholar, referencing the practice of writing over partially erased earlier text, Edward's reign would be the layer that shows through most clearly beneath the modern writing, not because it was last, but because it was written so deeply. This depth, the fundamental nature of Edward's impact, distinguishes him from kings who achieved more superficially spectacular but less lasting accomplishments. Henry VIII broke with Rome dramatically, but Edward's more subtle language reforms arguably shaped English identity more permanently. William the Conqueror seized England in a single campaign, but Edward's generations-long nation-building created what we recognise as England today. The truly great historical figures, observes a philosopher of history, don't just change events, they change the frame through which future generations view events. Edward III didn't just rule England, he helped define what England is. As you lie in bed tonight, in a world unimaginably different from Edward's medieval realm, countless threads still connect you to his time. If you speak English, you're using a language he elevated from common speech to official status. If you live in a common law country, your legal system builds on foundations he strengthened. If you believe national identity transcends class divisions, you're embracing a concept he helped pioneer. The beauty of history lies in these connections, the recognition that we're part of something larger than our individual lives. Edward III couldn't have imagined our world any more than we can truly comprehend his, yet the bridge between them stands firm, built from institutions, language, and identity he helped forge. History isn't just about what happened, concludes the elderly guide at Westminster Abbey, standing beside Edward's tomb as the last visitors depart for the evening. It's about what continues to happen because of what happened. Edward III continues to happen. His England continues to evolve, and as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of a 14-year-old boy who seized a kingdom from his mother's lover, transformed himself from puppet to legend, and became, by any reasonable measure, England's greatest medieval king. Rest